My name is Sue, and I am 54 years old. For 28 years, I have cleaned other people's homes for a living. I scrubbed their floors, washed their windows, and made their spaces shine. I never once felt ashamed of what I did. Not once. Until my own son stood in front of his friends at his 30th birthday party and turned my life's work into a punchline. What happened 1 hour later changed everything between us forever. Before I take you back to where it all began, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. And if stories about real life, real struggles, and real lessons touch your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Now let me tell you what I sacrificed to get to that moment, because without understanding the past, you cannot understand the pain. I met my husband Gary when we were both just 22 years old. He had this crooked smile that could light up any room and hands that were rough from honest work. Gary was an electrician, and a good one too. He took pride in every wire he connected, every panel he installed. I was working at a department store back then, selling women's clothing and dreaming about the life we would build together. We got married in a small ceremony at the local church in Columbus, Ohio. My mother made my dress. Gary's father lent us his old Buick for the honeymoon, which was just a weekend trip to a cabin by the lake. We did not have much, but we had each other, and that felt like everything. Our first apartment was tiny. The kitchen was so small that 2 people could not stand in it at the same time without bumping elbows. The radiator clanked all winter long, and the neighbors upstairs played their music too loud on weekends. But I loved that place. I loved coming home to Gary after work, cooking dinner together in that cramped little kitchen, falling asleep to the sound of his breathing beside me. When I was 26, I found out I was pregnant. I remember sitting on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the test in my hands, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Gary came home that night to find me crying at the kitchen table. He thought something was wrong until I showed him the test. He picked me up and spun me around that tiny kitchen, laughing and crying at the same time. We named our son Derek. He came into this world on a Tuesday morning in March, screaming his lungs out and gripping my finger with his tiny hand. I looked at that baby and made a silent promise. I swore I would give him everything I never had. I would work as hard as I needed to work. I would sacrifice whatever needed sacrificing. My son would have opportunities. My son would have choices. For the first 5 years, life was good. Hard, but good. Gary worked long hours, sometimes 6 days a week. I went back to the department store part-time once Derek was old enough for daycare. We were saving money slowly but surely. We talked about buying a house someday, maybe getting Derek into a good school district. We had plans. We had hope. Then the accident happened. Gary was working on a commercial building downtown. He was up on a ladder about 15 feet high when something went wrong. To this day, I do not know exactly what happened. The ladder slipped, or he lost his balance, or maybe it was faulty equipment. All I know is that my husband fell 15 feet and landed on concrete. I got the call at work. I remember dropping a stack of folded sweaters and running out of the store without even clocking out. By the time I got to the hospital, Gary was in surgery. The doctor came out hours later with a grim expression. Spinal injury, nerve damage. He would walk again, but never the same way. He would never climb another ladder. He would never work as an electrician again. The bills started piling up almost immediately. Hospital bills, physical therapy bills, medication costs. Our insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. I watched our savings account drain away like water through a sieve. The dreams we had built together crumbled under the weight of medical debt. I needed to find work. Real work. Something that would pay the bills and still let me be there for Gary and Derek. The department store could not give me more hours, and even if they could, it would not have been enough. I was desperate, scared, and running out of options. That is when my neighbor Linda came to me with an idea. She knew a woman who needed help cleaning her house. The woman was elderly, had trouble getting around, and was willing to pay cash. Linda thought of me because she knew I kept our apartment spotless despite everything we were going through. I hesitated at first. Something about cleaning someone else's home felt different from cleaning my own. There was a voice in my head. Maybe my mother's voice, maybe society's voice telling me that this was beneath me somehow, that I was capable of more. But then I thought about Derek. I thought about Gary lying in that hospital bed. I thought about the stack of bills on our kitchen table, and I realized that dignity was not about what job you did. Dignity was about doing whatever it took to take care of your family. I took that first cleaning job. The woman's name was Mrs. Patterson, and she lived in a beautiful Victorian house on the east side of town. She was kind to me from the very first day. She showed me around, told me what she needed, and then left me to work. When I finished, she pressed cash into my hand and said something I will never forget. She said, "You have a gift, dear. This house has not looked this good in years." A gift. She called it a gift. I started picking up more clients through word of mouth. Mrs. Patterson told her friends. They told their friends. Within a year, I had a full schedule. I was cleaning 5 or 6 houses a week, making more money than I ever had at the department store, and I was home every afternoon when Derek got off the school bus. Those early years were exhausting. I would wake up at 5 in the morning to get a head start on the day. I would clean until my back ached and my hands were raw. Then I would come home, help Derek with his homework, make dinner, and spend the evening helping Gary with his exercises. Most nights, I fell asleep the moment my head touched the pillow. But I did not complain. How could I? Every dollar I earned went toward building a better life for my son. Every floor I scrubbed was one step closer to Derek's future. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that someday, when Derek was grown and successful, I would look back on these years with pride. Gary did his best to contribute. He took on small tasks, things he could do from home. He handled our finances, made phone calls, kept our lives organized. But his health never fully recovered. The pain was constant. The medications took their toll. I watched the man I loved fade a little more each year. When Derek was 16, Gary passed away. It was a Tuesday, just like the day Derek was born. I held my husband's hand as he took his last breath, and I felt a piece of my heart leave with him. After the funeral, I sat Derek down at our kitchen table. The same table where we had eaten 1,000 meals together. The same table where I had helped him with his homework since kindergarten. I looked at my son now, almost a man, and I made him a promise. I told him that nothing would change. I told him that I would keep working, keep providing, keep fighting for his future. I told him that his father's death would not derail his dreams. Derek hugged me that day. He held me tight and said, "I know how hard you work, Mom. I will make you proud someday. I promise." I believed him. I held on to those words like a lifeline. They got me through the lonely nights, the aching joints, the endless hours of scrubbing and sweeping and polishing. My son would make me proud. My son understood, or so I thought. Derek was a good kid growing up. At least, that is what I believed for a long time. He helped me around the house without being asked. He kept his grades up. He was polite to the neighbors and respectful to his teachers. When summer came, he would sometimes come with me to my cleaning jobs. He would sit in the corner with a book while I worked, and afterward, we would stop for ice cream on the way home. I remember one summer afternoon when Derek was about 12 years old. We were sitting in the parking lot of the ice cream shop, eating our cones and watching the cars go by. Derek turned to me with chocolate smeared on his chin and said something that made my heart swell. He said, "Mom, I think you work harder than anyone I know. I am proud of you." I almost cried right there in that parking lot. I hugged him so tight that his ice cream almost fell. Those words meant everything to me. They were proof that my sacrifices were not in vain. My son saw me. My son understood. As Derek got older, things started to shift in ways I did not notice at first. He became more focused on his studies, which I encouraged. He spent more time with friends, which I thought was healthy. He talked less about our family and more about his future. I told myself this was normal. Teenagers pull away. They find their own identities. It was not personal. When it came time for college, I had saved enough to cover most of his tuition at Ohio State University. It was not easy. There were years when I barely bought myself new clothes so that Derek could have what he needed, but seeing my son walk onto that campus, knowing that I had made it possible, filled me with a pride that I cannot put into words. Derek chose to study business. He was smart, ambitious, driven. He talked about corporate careers, investment banking, climbing the ladder to success. I supported every dream he had. I told him he could be anything he wanted to be. I believed it with my whole heart. But during those college years, something changed. I noticed it in small ways at first. Derek called home less often. When I asked about his friends, he was vague. When I offered to visit him on campus, he always had an excuse. Too busy with exams. Too much going on with his fraternity. Maybe next month, Mom. Next month never came. I met some of his college friends once by accident. I had driven up to surprise Derek for his birthday during his junior year. I found him at a restaurant with a group of young people who looked like they had stepped out of a magazine. Designer clothes, expensive watches. The kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. When Derek saw me walk in, his face went pale. He introduced me quickly, mumbling my name, and then made an excuse about needing to talk to me outside. His friends barely acknowledged me. One girl looked me up and down with an expression I recognized. I had seen it on the faces of some of my wealthy clients over the years. It was the look people give to those they consider beneath them. Outside the restaurant, Derek was agitated. He asked me why I had not called first. He said it was embarrassing to have his mother show up unannounced. He said his friends did not understand our situation. Our situation, like being his mother, was a situation to be managed. I drove home that night with a heavy heart, but I made excuses for him. College was stressful. He was trying to fit in. He would come back to himself once he graduated and entered the real world. After graduation, Derek landed a job at a major financial firm in Columbus. It was everything he had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for. I was so proud of him that I could barely contain myself. I told everyone I knew. My son, the businessman. My son with the corner office. My son who was going places. Derek moved into an apartment in a fancy part of the city. High ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, a doorman in the lobby. The first time I visited, I felt out of place. The furniture looked like it cost more than my annual income. The art on the walls was abstract and expensive, and completely beyond my understanding. Derek seemed uncomfortable having me there. He kept glancing at his phone, checking the time, making excuses about meetings he had to prepare for. When I suggested we go out to dinner, he said he had already eaten. When I offered to come back another time, he said his schedule was unpredictable. I left that apartment feeling like a stranger in my own son's life. Things got worse when Derek started dating Amanda. She was the daughter of the Whitfield family owners of a chain of car dealerships across the state. Old money, country club memberships, vacation homes in places I had only seen in magazines. Derek never invited me to meet Amanda. He never brought her to my house. When I asked about her, he gave me short answers. She is fine. We are doing well. Maybe you can meet her sometime. Sometime. Another word that meant never. I learned more about Amanda through other people than I ever learned from Derek. One of my clients mentioned seeing them at a charity gala. Another mentioned that they were featured in the local society pages. My son was living a life I knew nothing about, and he seemed perfectly content to keep it that way. One day, I ran into Derek and Amanda by chance at a grocery store of all places. They were in the produce section examining organic avocados. Amanda was beautiful in that polished way that wealthy women often are. Perfect hair, perfect nails, perfect posture. She looked at me with curiosity when Derek introduced us, but there was no warmth in her eyes. Derek introduced me as Sue. Just Sue. Not Mom, not his mother. Just Sue. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. My own son was ashamed to call me his mother in front of his girlfriend. He was ashamed of the woman who had scrubbed floors and toilets and windows to give him the life he now enjoyed. I should have said something that day. I should have confronted him right there between the avocados and the bell peppers. But I did not. I smiled. I made small talk. I pretended everything was fine. Because that is what mothers do. We swallow our pain. We make excuses for our children. We tell ourselves that things will get better if we just give them time. I gave Derek time. I gave him space. I waited for him to come back to me to remember who he was and where he came from. I was still waiting when the invitation to his 30th birthday party arrived. The invitation came in the mail on a Wednesday afternoon. I remember holding the envelope in my hands, staring at the elegant calligraphy that spelled out my name. Mrs. Sue Lawson. Not Mom. Mrs. Sue Lawson. Inside was a formal invitation to Derek's 30th birthday celebration. The party was being held at one of the finest restaurants in Columbus. Black tie optional. RSVP requested. It looked like something out of a magazine, like the kind of event I had only ever seen in movies. I called Derek that evening to confirm I had received the invitation. His voice was strange on the phone. Not quite happy to hear from me, but not quite dismissive either. He said he hoped I could make it. He said it would mean a lot to him. It would mean a lot to him. After all those months of distance, after all those excuses and canceled visits and short phone calls, my son wanted me at his party. Maybe this was the turning point I had been waiting for. Maybe he was finally ready to let me back into his life. I threw myself into preparation. I went to the mall and spent hours looking for the perfect dress. I ended up choosing a deep blue gown that the saleswoman said brought out my eyes. It cost more than I usually spent on clothes in an entire year, but I did not care. This was my son's birthday. I wanted to look my best. I had my hair done at a salon. I bought new shoes that pinched my feet but looked elegant. I spent an entire evening practicing walking in heels because it had been so long since I had worn them. But the thing I was most excited about was the gift I had chosen for Derek. It was his father's watch. The one Gary had worn every day of our marriage. The one I had kept in a velvet box in my dresser drawer since the day he died. I had never given it to Derek before because the time never felt right. But now, on his 30th birthday, at this fancy celebration of everything he had achieved, it felt perfect. The watch was not expensive by the standards Derek was used to now. It was a simple timepiece, well worn and slightly scratched. But it carried the weight of his father's memory. It represented everything Gary had been. Hardworking, honest, devoted to his family. I hoped that when Derek opened that box, he would remember. He would remember who his father was. He would remember who his mother was. He would remember where he came from. The night of the party, I arrived at the restaurant about 30 minutes early. I could not help it. I was nervous and excited and terrified all at once. The building was stunning all glass, and modern architecture, the kind of place where a single appetizer probably cost more than I earned in an hour. I walked through the front doors and immediately felt out of place. The lobby was filled with people who looked like they belonged there. Men in tailored suits, women in designer gowns, everyone holding champagne glasses and laughing at jokes I could not hear. A young woman at a podium asked for my name. When I told her, she scanned her list and nodded. She directed me toward a private room in the back of the restaurant, the room reserved for Derek's party. I walked down a long hallway, my heels clicking on the marble floor. With every step, my confidence wavered a little more. These were not my people. This was not my world. But Derek was my son, and he had invited me here. Surely that had to count for something. When I entered the party room, I was overwhelmed. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. A live band played soft jazz in the corner. Waiters circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres that I could not identify. There must have been 50 people in the room, all of them looking polished and sophisticated and completely at ease. I spotted Derek across the room. He was standing with a group of young men, all of them laughing about something. Amanda was beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She was wearing a gown that probably cost more than my car. I made my way toward them, clutching the wrapped gift box in my hands. Derek saw me approaching, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe. Or was it discomfort? I could not tell. He greeted me with a quick hug and an air kiss near my cheek. The kind of greeting you give to a distant acquaintance, not the woman who raised you. He introduced me to Amanda, who smiled politely and said she had heard so much about me. I doubted that was true. For the next hour, I drifted through the party like a ghost. I tried to make conversation with the other guests, but every interaction felt strained. When people asked how I knew Derek, I said I was his mother. Some of them looked surprised. Others looked uncomfortable. A few simply nodded and then found excuses to walk away. No one asked about my life. No one asked what I did for a living. It was as if I was invisible, a placeholder at a party where I did not belong. I found myself standing near the bar, nursing a glass of water and watching my son from across the room. He looked happy. He looked successful. He looked like everything I had worked so hard to give him. But he also looked like a stranger. That is when I heard the conversation that changed everything. Derek was standing with a group of his friends near the center of the room. One of them, a tall man with slicked back hair and an expensive suit, was asking Derek about his family. The man's name was Harrison. I had heard Derek mention him once before. He worked in media or something like that. He had a big following on social media. He was the kind of person who always needed to be the center of attention. Harrison was asking questions in a way that felt more like an interrogation than a friendly conversation. He wanted to know about Derek's background, his parents, how he had gotten to where he was today. Derek answered carefully at first. He talked about his education, his career, his ambitions. But Harrison kept pushing. He wanted to know about Derek's family specifically. What did his father do? What did his mother do? I watched Derek's face tighten. I saw him glance around the room, maybe looking for an escape. But Harrison was relentless. Finally, Derek said that his father had passed away years ago. His voice was flat when he said it, as if he was reciting a fact, rather than remembering a person he loved. Harrison nodded sympathetically, and then asked the question that would shatter my heart. What about your mother? What does she do? I was standing maybe 20 feet away, close enough to hear every word, close enough to see the expression on my son's face as he considered his answer. Derek paused for a moment. Then he laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was a dismissive laugh, the kind of laugh people use when they want to minimize something. My mom cleans houses for a living, he said. He said it like it was a joke. He said it like it was something to be ashamed of. He said it like 28 years of my blood, sweat, and tears were nothing more than a punchline. The group around him laughed. Harrison laughed the loudest. Amanda covered her mouth with her hand, but I could see she was laughing too. I stood there frozen. The glass of water in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The noise of the party faded to a dull roar in my ears. All I could hear was that laughter. All I could see was my son's face twisted into an expression I did not recognize. 28 years. 28 years of sacrifice. 28 years of putting his needs before my own. And this was how he repaid me. With mockery, with shame, with public humiliation. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not cause a scene. Instead, I walked calmly to a table near the door. I set down the gift box, the one containing his father's watch. I did not leave a note. I did not say goodbye. I simply walked out. The night air was cold when I stepped outside. I walked to my car in silence, my heels clicking on the pavement. I unlocked the door, sat down in the driver's seat, and stared straight ahead at the darkness. Then the tears came. They came in waves and great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for the years I had sacrificed. I cried for the son I thought I knew. I cried for the mother I had tried so hard to be. I drove home that night in a fog. I do not remember the route I took or how long it took me to get there. All I remember is walking through my front door, sitting down in my living room, and feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. My house was dark when I arrived home. I did not bother turning on the lights. I just sat there on my couch, still wearing that expensive blue dress, staring at the shadows on the wall. The photographs were everywhere. Derek as a baby, wrapped in a yellow blanket. Derek at age 5, missing his front teeth and grinning at the camera. Derek at his high school graduation, holding his diploma like a trophy. Derek and Gary laughing together at a barbecue in our backyard. Every picture told a story of love and sacrifice. Every frame held a memory I had treasured for decades. But now, those images felt different. Now they felt like evidence of a lie I had been telling myself. When had it started? When had my son begun to feel ashamed of me? Was it college, when he met those wealthy friends? Was it earlier, when he first realized that other kids had bigger houses and nicer cars? Or was it something I had done, some failure in my parenting, that had planted the seeds of his contempt? I replayed moments in my mind. The time he asked me not to come to his school play because he said it would be boring. The time he did not invite me to his college graduation dinner with his friends. The time he introduced me as Sue instead of Mom. The signs had been there all along. I had just refused to see them. My phone rang, cutting through the silence. I looked at the screen and saw Margaret's name. Margaret had been one of my clients for almost 15 years. She was 72 years old, a widow like me, and over the years she had become more than a client. She had become a friend. I almost did not answer. I did not want to talk to anyone. But something made me pick up the phone. Margaret's voice was warm and concerned. She asked me how the party had gone. She knew how excited I had been about Derek's birthday, how much hope I had placed in that invitation. I tried to say that everything was fine, but my voice cracked on the word fine, and before I knew it, I was telling her everything. The laughter, the mockery, the way my own son had turned my life's work into a joke. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she was not entirely shocked. I asked her what she meant, and she hesitated before answering. Then she told me something I wished I had never heard. A few months ago, Margaret had been at a charity luncheon. The same kind of event where Columbus society gathered to see and be seen. Derek and Amanda had been there making the rounds, shaking hands with important people. Margaret had overheard them talking to another couple. The conversation had turned to family backgrounds as it often did in those circles. And Derek had said something that made Margaret's blood run cold. He had said that his mother owned a home services company, that she had built it from the ground up and now managed a team of employees. He had painted a picture of entrepreneurship and success, conveniently erasing the reality of me on my hands and knees, scrubbing someone else's toilet. Margaret had not told me at the time because she did not want to hurt me. She had hoped she had misunderstood. But now, after what had happened at the party, she felt I needed to know the truth. My son had not just been ashamed of me in private. He had been actively lying about me in public. He had constructed an entire false narrative about who I was and what I did. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had felt before. It was one thing to be embarrassed by your mother. It was another thing entirely to erase her. To rewrite her story so completely that the real woman disappeared. Margaret told me more. She said that Amanda's family, the Whitfields, believed that I came from a respectable background. They believed that Derek's success was built on a foundation of family achievement. They had no idea that I spent my days cleaning the homes of people just like them. I sat in the darkness absorbing this information. My son had not just mocked me. He had erased me. He had turned me into someone else entirely so that he could fit into a world he thought was better than the one I had given him. The phone rang again about an hour after I hung up with Margaret. This time, it was Derek. His voice was different now. Gone was the confident, dismissive tone I had heard at the party. In its place was something I had not heard from him in years. Panic. He asked me where I was. He asked why I had left the party without saying goodbye. He asked if I was okay. I did not answer his questions. Instead, I asked him one of my own. Why did you say that about me? There was silence on the other end of the line. A long, uncomfortable silence that told me everything I needed to know. Then Derek started talking, fast and frantic, his words tumbling over each other like water over rocks. He said something had happened at the party. Something bad? He said he needed me to come back. He said everything was falling apart. I asked him what had happened, but he would not give me a straight answer. He just kept saying that he needed my help, that I was the only one who could fix this. I told him no. I told him that I had spent 28 years fixing things for him. 28 years sacrificing everything so that he could have a better life. And this was how he had repaid me, with mockery, with lies, with shame. Derek's voice changed again. The panic gave way to desperation. He started pleading with me. He said he was sorry. He said he had made a mistake. He said he would do anything if I would just help him. I hung up the phone. Then I sat in the darkness for a long time, wondering how my beautiful baby boy had become this stranger who could hurt me so deeply. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my living room watching the darkness slowly give way to dawn, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. Around 7 a.m, Margaret called me again. Her voice was urgent, carrying news that would change everything. She asked me if I had been on the internet yet. I told her no. I had not looked at my phone or my computer since coming home from the party. Margaret told me I needed to look. Something was happening. Something big. I found my laptop and opened it with trembling hands. It did not take long to find what Margaret was talking about. The video was everywhere, on social media, on news sites, on every platform I could think of. Someone had recorded Derek at the party, the moment when he mocked me. The laughter that followed, all of it captured on video and shared with the world. The person who recorded and posted it was Harrison. The same Harrison who had asked Derek about his family. The same Harrison who had laughed the loudest when Derek made his joke. Harrison was not just some random friend. He was a social media personality, someone who made his living from viral content. He had seen an opportunity at that party, and he had taken it. The video was titled, "Trust Fund Bro Mocks His Own Mother." It had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. The comment section was flooded with outrage. People were calling Derek entitled ungrateful disgusting. They were demanding consequences. They were tagging his employer, his girlfriend's family, everyone they could think of. I watched the video once. I could not bring myself to watch it again. Seeing my son's face, hearing his dismissive laugh, feeling the knife twist in my heart all over again, was too much to bear. But the video kept spreading. By midday, it had been picked up by news outlets. Financial executive publicly humiliates mother. Viral video shows man mocking mom's job. The headlines were brutal, and they were everywhere. The consequences came swift and severe. Derek's company issued a statement by that afternoon. They were launching an internal review. They took matters of employee conduct seriously. They would be examining whether Derek's behavior aligned with their corporate values. I knew what that meant. I had cleaned enough corporate offices to understand the language of professional distancing. Derek's job was in danger. Everything he had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for, was suddenly hanging by a thread. But that was not the worst of it. Amanda's family saw the video too. The Whitfields, the car dealership dynasty, the people Derek had worked so hard to impress. They did not just see my son mocking his mother. They saw him revealing the truth he had hidden from them for so long. The lie about my successful business. The false picture of wealth and status. All of it crumbled in those few seconds of viral video. Amanda called Derek that same evening. I know this because Derek called me immediately afterward, more desperate than I had ever heard him. Amanda had ended their relationship. She told Derek that she could not be with someone who treated his own mother that way. She told him that her family was horrified. She told him that everything they had built together was over. Derek was sobbing on the phone. Great heaving sobs that reminded me of when he was a little boy and scraped his knee. But he was not a little boy anymore. He was a 30-year-old man facing the consequences of his own choices. He kept saying he was sorry. He kept asking me to help him. He kept saying that I was the only one who could fix this. I listened to my son cry, and I felt something I did not expect. I felt pity, yes, but I also felt a strange sense of detachment. This was not my mess to clean up. I had spent my whole life cleaning up messes. Not this time. I told Derek that I needed time. I told him that I could not be his solution. I told him that he needed to face what he had done, really face it, before we could even begin to talk about the future. Then I hung up the phone again. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and messages. Reporters wanted to interview me. Friends and former clients reached out to offer support. Complete strangers found ways to contact me wanting to share their own stories of ungrateful children and broken families. I ignored most of it. I needed time to think, time to process, time to figure out who I was going to be when this was all over. Derek kept calling. Multiple times a day at first, then tapering off as he realized I was not going to answer. He left voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry to pleading. He sent text messages that grew increasingly desperate. He had lost his job. The company decided that the reputational damage was too severe. They let him go with a small severance package and a lot of legal language about non-disclosure agreements. Amanda refused to speak to him. Her family had closed ranks, shutting Derek out completely. The fairy tale life he had constructed so carefully had collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Margaret came to visit me about a week after the party. She brought homemade soup and a box of tissues like she always did when she thought I needed taking care of. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had made so many promises to Derek over the years, and we talked for hours. Margaret asked me what I wanted to do. Not what I should do or what society expected me to do. What I wanted. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered. I wanted to stop being invisible. I wanted the world to know who I really was, not the joke my son had made me into, or the fiction he had created for his wealthy friends. I wanted to stand up and be seen. Margaret smiled when I said that. She told me she knew exactly what I needed to do. 2 days later, I sat down for an interview with a local television station. Margaret had arranged it through one of her many connections. The reporter was a woman named Janet, about my age, who treated me with respect from the moment we met. The interview was not what people expected. I did not cry on camera. I did not bash my son. I did not play the victim seeking sympathy. Instead, I talked about my work. I talked about the 28 years I had spent cleaning homes for families across Columbus. I talked about the relationships I had built with my clients, many of whom had become dear friends. I talked about the pride I took in making someone's home a better place. I talked about Gary. About the accident that changed our lives. About the choice I made to provide for my family in any way I could. And yes, I talked about Derek. But not in the way people expected. I did not condemn him. I did not call him names. I simply said that I was sad. Sad that my son had felt ashamed of honest work. Sad that he had not understood the value of what I did. Sad that somewhere along the way, I had failed to teach him that dignity comes from who you are, not what you do. I said that I did not regret my choices. I said that I would make them all over again if I had to. I said that cleaning houses for a living was nothing to be ashamed of, and that anyone who thought otherwise had a lot to learn about the real world. The interview aired 2 days later. The response was overwhelming. People who had never met me reached out to share their support. Other cleaning professionals sent messages thanking me for speaking up for their profession. Former clients I had not heard from in years called to tell me how much my work had meant to them. One of those clients was a woman named Patricia, who had been one of my first customers after Mrs. Patterson. Patricia was now in her 80s, living in a retirement community. She called me in tears, telling me that I had been like family to her for decades. She said that watching me clean her home with such care and attention had been one of the highlights of her weeks. Another client was James, a successful surgeon who I had cleaned for during the last 10 years. He wrote a letter that he shared publicly, describing how I had taken care of his home during his wife's illness, going above and beyond what was expected, providing not just cleaning, but companionship during a difficult time. These testimonials spread across the internet, creating a counter-narrative to the viral video. People started seeing me not as a victim to be pitied, but as a woman to be admired. A woman who had done honest work with dignity and grace. And then something unexpected happened. A woman named Sandra called me one afternoon. Sandra was the CEO of one of the largest home services companies in the Midwest. She had seen my interview, read the testimonials from my clients, and she had a proposition for me. She wanted me to come work for her company. Not as a cleaner, but as a training manager. She wanted me to share my 28 years of experience with their employees. She wanted me to help them understand what it meant to take pride in their work. The salary was more than I had ever earned. The benefits included health insurance, retirement contributions, and paid vacation. It was quite literally a dream offer. I accepted. 6 months have passed since that birthday party. 6 months of healing, growing, and rebuilding. Derek lost everything he thought he wanted. His job, his girlfriend, his carefully constructed image. He had to move out of his fancy apartment and into a small studio on the other side of town. He found work at a smaller company starting from near the bottom. The fall from grace was long and hard. At first, I kept my distance, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I needed time to heal. I needed time to understand my own feelings. I needed time to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with my son going forward. Derek sent me messages during those months. Some were angry, blaming me for the interview and the attention it brought. Some were self-pitying, lamenting the life he had lost. But gradually, the tone of his messages changed. He started apologizing. Not the desperate, panicked apologies of the night of the party, but quieter, more thoughtful ones. He started acknowledging specific things he had done wrong. He started asking questions about my life, my work, my feelings. I did not respond to most of these messages, but I read them all. Then one Sunday morning, Derek showed up at my door. I had not seen him in person since the party. He looked different, thinner, less polished. There were dark circles under his eyes and a humility in his posture that I had never seen before. But what struck me most was what he was carrying. A bucket, a mop, a caddy full of cleaning supplies. He told me he wanted to go with me to work. He wanted to spend a day doing what I did. He wanted to understand. I stared at him for a long moment. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to hug him and tell him everything would be okay. I did none of those things. Instead, I told him to get in the car. That day, Derek worked alongside me at one of my remaining private clients, an elderly woman named Florence, who I still visited once a week, even with my new job, because she had become like family. I watched my son scrub floors and clean windows and dust shelves. I watched him struggle with the physical demands of the work. I watched sweat drip down his face and frustration flash in his eyes. But I also watched him push through. I watched him finish every task I gave him. I watched him treat Florence with respect and kindness when she offered us lemonade at the end of the day. In the car on the way home, Derek was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. He said he understood now. He said he had never realized how hard the work was, how much skill and dedication it required. He said he was ashamed, not of me, of himself. He said he had spent so many years trying to be someone else, trying to fit into a world he thought was better than the one I had given him. He said he had lost himself along the way. He had forgotten what mattered. I listened to my son speak, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness is not something you grant in a single moment. It is something you build day by day, choice by choice. But I felt hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope that maybe someday we could find our way back to each other. That was 6 months ago. Derek and I are still on that journey. There are good days when we talk on the phone for hours, reconnecting over shared memories and tentative plans for the future. There are harder days when the pain of what happened resurfaces and I need space again. Derek is still rebuilding his life. He is still learning what it means to earn respect instead of demanding it. He is still figuring out who he wants to be. I am rebuilding too. My new job has given me purpose and confidence I did not know I was missing. I train young people now, teaching them the skills I learned over 28 years. I show them that there is no shame in honest work, that dignity comes from how you do your job, not what your job is. I still think about that night at the party sometimes. The laughter, the pain, the moment when my heart broke into 1,000 pieces. But I also think about everything that came after. The way I stood up for myself. The way I refused to be invisible. The way I found strength I did not know I had. And I think about the lesson in all of this. The lesson that cost so much, but taught me so much more. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we love the most. The question is not whether to forgive. The question is whether they have earned it. And even more importantly, the question is whether we are willing to do the hard work of healing regardless of what they do. I am doing that work every single day. Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt ashamed or been made to feel ashamed of honest work? Have you ever had someone you love make you feel small? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below. Let us build a community of people who lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories of real life and real resilience. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories like this one. And share this video with someone who needs to hear that their work matters, that their sacrifices matter, that they matter. Thank you for being here with me today. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it brought you something valuable, whether that is comfort, perspective, or just the knowledge that you are not alone. Take care of yourselves out there. And remember, dignity is not about what you do. It is about who you are.